Thank you again all for joining us today. I'll start by reminding you all that we are recording this session. This is the last of 3 sessions on this topic, and all will be available. Each will be its own recording, and we'll hope to have those ready by the end of the month. And if you have registered for this talk, for any of the 3 that you've attended, you will automatically receive those recordings via email. And we'll also plan to put them on our website, so you'll be able to find them there as well. As I mentioned earlier, we are going to use the chat box tonight. Questions will be answered at the end, but feel free to comment throughout or ask questions throughout, and we'll address those once Jenny is done talking. We do have a land acknowledgement statement that we'd like to share before we get started, so I'll go ahead and read that out. We wish to acknowledge and honor the Indigenous communities native to this region and recognize that Indiana University Bloomington was built on Indigenous homelands and resources. We recognize the Miami, Delaware, Potawatomi, and Shawnee people as past, present, and future caretakers of this land. And to get started tonight, we want to welcome you to the 3rd in a series of 3 talks on the subject of exile and displacement, World War II, and the transformation of the Western art world. The subject of tonight's talk is émigré art dealers and the American art market, and is presented by Jenny McComas, the Eskenazi Museum of Art's curator of European and American art, and head of the museum's World War II era provenance research project. And again, as I mentioned earlier, all of our recordings will be available at the end of the month, and you'll receive those automatically if you've registered. So with that, I will pass the baton to Jenny.
Thank you so much, Erin. And thanks also to my colleague, Laura Shepper. Both Erin and Laura have been so helpful in the logistics and the technical aspects of these 3 talks. So for those of you who are joining us either for the 3rd time or the first time, I'm really glad that you're here. I've been hearing some great feedback from some of you over the past couple of weeks that you've been enjoying the series, so that's wonderful to know. Tonight, and the 3rd installment of the talks that are really related in a variety of ways to our World War II provenance research project. We're really going to look at the art market tonight, émigré art dealers and the American art market. This talk is going to draw somewhat on the themes that were raised in my previous 2 sessions on the looting of Jewish art collections in Europe, as well as the Nazi Degenerate Art campaign against modern art. Before I get into the talk, I want to say a few words about art dealers and why it's important to understand the role they play in the art world. So art dealers aren't just salespeople or even just intermediaries between artists and collectors. Instead, the most successful and best known art dealers of the past century have actively sought to nurture the careers of the artists they represent and to cultivate the taste of collectors and the broader public. By the late 18th century in Western Europe, art dealers were stepping into the role of patron, a role which had formerly been the preserve of the church and the upper classes. Dealers who operated as patrons could shape the careers of their artists and help develop an audience and a commercial market for their work. And again, I'm talking about dealers who dealt in the contemporary art of their day. Obviously, many art dealers also have specialized in historical art forms. But the dealers who worked with contemporary art, well, really with historical art too, have all played a critical role in shaping the canon. Artists who achieved great success in their lifetimes usually did so thanks to the efforts of the art dealers with whom they worked. And this doesn't mean that those were the only artists of their day who were worthy of attention. In my own research, I've often discovered the work of very interesting and talented artists who have remained little known simply because they never established a solid relationship with a dealer. In our last session, we looked at the defamation of modern art in Nazi Germany, the so-called Degenerate Art campaign. I'm showing you, again, an image of the Degenerate Art exhibition in the slide. Although this campaign most visibly targeted artists, it was in many ways directed towards art dealers and art collectors, to those people who are responsible for promoting the artists deemed unacceptable by the Third Reich. Dealers of modern art, therefore, often chose to emigrate. They were joined by numerous artists, art historians, and museum directors and curators, all of whom were prompted by the rise of fascism in Europe to find new homes. This mass emigration of cultural figures also included scores of writers, filmmakers, and scholars. Many fled because they were Jewish and consequently worried about their safety, and because they were denied the ability to practice their profession by the Nazi regime or its collaborators. Others left in protest of the treatment of their Jewish colleagues, or because their anti-fascist political activities compromised their safety, or simply because they were opposed to living in a fascist society. In the first session, 2 weeks ago, I discussed the difficulties would-be immigrants faced in obtaining visas, especially to the United States. Although many artists and cultural figures were indeed unsuccessful in their attempts to emigrate, overall, there was more assistance provided to cultural figures and to scholars than to the general public. Tonight, we'll look at three of the most significant émigré art dealers who settled in New York between 1936 and 1941. Although I'll focus on their associations with the Eskenazi Museum of Art, the role these dealers played in more broadly transforming the American art world cannot be underestimated. And if you'd like to learn more about them or about several other émigré art dealers who won't factor into my talk tonight, I recently wrote an essay on this topic, and that's available on the museum's website. And Erin, if you wouldn't mind, could you put the link to that into the chat? Thank you. Now, before I delve into my discussion of the art dealers, I should provide a little more context about the prehistory of the Eskenazi Museum of Art in the 1940s and 50s, at the time we worked with these dealers. In the brief overview of the museum that I provided a couple of weeks ago, I mentioned that we officially trace our history to 1941. At that time, there was no museum per se at Indiana University, but a formalized and robust calendar of special exhibitions was established that year, and a small-scale acquisitions program began to develop. This was under the auspices of the newly appointed chair of the Fine Arts Department, Henry Radford Hope, who you see here shortly after his arrival in Bloomington. Hope eventually did become the founding director of the museum, which acquired its first permanent space and official recognition on campus in the early 1960s. In my upcoming discussion of the émigré art dealers, Hope's name will come up again and again. So let me provide a little background about who Henry Hope was. Born in 1905 in Massachusetts, Hope traveled to Europe in the mid-1930s to recover from tuberculosis. While there, he became profoundly interested in art and enrolled in art history courses at the Sorbonne in Paris. He returned to the US in 1938 and entered the graduate program in art history at Harvard. There he studied with Professor Paul Sachs, who trained several generations of American museum professionals between the 1920s and the 1940s. It was thanks to Sachs's recommendation that Hope was offered the position of art department chair at IU in 1941. And in addition to working on improving and expanding the art department, Hope, as I mentioned, mounted numerous exhibitions on campus. He brought in circulating exhibitions from the Met and MoMA and borrowed individual works from major New York art dealers. And here's an installation photo from an exhibition of contemporary American art that he organized in 1944. Hope was also an active participant outside the university in the arena of cultural diplomacy, especially in the 1950s during the Cold War. He served on the board of the American Federation of Arts, which advocated for international artistic exchange And he was the US delegate on art activities and advisor on cultural affairs to UNESCO. In 1959, he was also part of the selection committee for the American National Exhibition, a controversial show which introduced contemporary American art, including abstract expressionism, to audiences in Moscow. From the beginning of his time at IU, Hope envisioned establishing an art museum, but the American entry into World War II put his plans on hold temporarily. In the meantime, he began developing his own art collection, starting in 1944. That year, Hope married Sarah Ann Adams, a member of the wealthy Lilly family of Indianapolis. She too was passionate about art, and thanks to her resources, the couple began collecting together on their honeymoon in New York that summer. The Hope's collection would emphasize contemporary French and American art and would contain some particularly fine examples of modernist sculpture. As Hope was already working with New York dealers to borrow works for exhibitions at IU, these established relationships likely benefited him as a new collector. And as we'll see, he worked very closely with several émigré art dealers. Let's start with Paul Rosenberg, the art dealer from whom Henry and Sally Hope initiated their collecting activities. On their 1944 honeymoon, they purchased major paintings by Pablo Picasso, Georges Braque, Marston Hartley, and Max Weber from Rosenberg. All of these paintings, seen here, are now in the Eskenazi's collection. Paul Rosenberg can rightly be considered one of the most influential art dealers of the 20th century. During his career, he worked with major museums and collectors throughout Europe and the Americas, and represented the most groundbreaking French artists of the early 20th century. Rosenberg was born into his profession, so to speak, as his father was a dealer of Impressionist painting in Paris. Both Paul and his brother Leonce became art dealers, both championing modern French artists. Paul was especially known for his promotion of Cubism, and he had exclusive contracts with Picasso and Braque in the 1920s and 30s. Other contemporary French artists he represented included Fernand Léger, Henri Matisse, and Aristide Maillot. His gallery also stocked works by 19th century French masters, such as Ingres, Delacroix, Courbet, Cézanne, Monet, and Renoir. With the rise of fascism in Europe in the mid-1930s, Rosenberg began transferring works from his gallery and collection off of the European continent. To begin with, he joined with his brother-in-law, Jacques Helft, to open a branch of the Rosenberg Gallery in London. Our Picasso painting, The Studio, was among the works transferred to the London Gallery. And in 1936, it was featured in a major surrealist exhibition held at the New Burlington Galleries. You can see it circled here in the photograph. Now, this is the same London gallery that mounted the 20th century German art exhibition 2 years later, 1938, in response to the Degenerate Art exhibition. And we talked about that a bit last week. Rosenberg also arranged to lend many works from his collection to exhibitions abroad, especially in the Americas. For example, in late summer of 1939, he lent 19 paintings by Georges Braque to a major Braque retrospective organized by the Arts Club of Chicago. This group of works included the Napkin Ring, which was perhaps one of Rosenberg's most cherished Braque paintings. The Napkin Ring is one of 4 horizontal still life compositions known as the Rosenberg Quartet. All were commissioned by the dealer in the late 1920s to hang in his Paris dining room. He also had mosaic copies made of each still life, and these were installed in the floor of his apartment. The Braque paintings arrived in Chicago shortly before the outbreak of war in Europe. Their travels from France to the US are very well documented in the papers of the Arts Club, which are held by the Newberry Library in Chicago. The Arts Club's retrospective traveled to the Phillips Memorial Collection in Washington, D.C., and the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. Following the retrospective, Rosenberg's paintings went on to the Golden Gate International Exposition, also in San Francisco, as they could not be returned to war-torn Europe. Meanwhile, at the same time, Rosenberg and his family were making their way from occupied France to the United States via neutral Portugal. This was a typical route for émigrés to follow, especially after the outbreak of war, when it was difficult, if not impossible, to obtain a visa from within a Nazi-occupied country. The Rosenbergs arrived in New York in September of 1940. Conveniently, the San Francisco Exposition closed the same month, so Rosenberg would have received a major shipment of his paintings not long after his arrival in the US, and these works would form the basis for the new gallery he opened in New York. Back in Nazi-occupied Paris, the townhouse that housed the Paul Rosenberg Gallery and the family's apartments was sequestered by the Germans, who established in it the Institute for the Study of the Jewish Question. This institute generated anti-Semitic propaganda, sometimes in the form of exhibitions, and the Nazis' appropriation of a renowned Jewish gallerist's property for this purpose was not accidental. After the war, when Rosenberg was able to return to France and learned what had become of his Paris home, he decided he could never live in the building again, though he did remove the Brock mosaics. Rosenberg's collection was also subject to extensive looting by the Nazis. Even though he had successfully moved much of the collection outside of continental Europe, about 400 paintings remained in France. He tried to evade Nazi detection of the collection by storing many of the works in a bank vault in southwest France under the name of an employee. The ploy didn't work, and these paintings were seized by the ERR, or the Einsatzstab Reichsleiter Rosenberg, which again was the organization set up specifically to confiscate Jewish collections. Because Rosenberg handled valuable works by highly sought-after artists, the Nazis engineered the sale of many of them, and they ended up in various private collections. Rosenberg consequently spent most of his last decade in court trying to retrieve his paintings. Before his death in 1959, he managed to have about 300 of them restituted, and more have since been returned to his heirs. But now let's return to his activities during the war years. Rosenberg's arrival in New York generated great excitement in the art world, as described in the periodical The Art Digest. When rumor first intimated that Paul Rosenberg, internationally known Paris dealer in modern art, would open a gallery in New York, 57th Street anticipated something akin to a clap of thunder. And for any of you who don't know, 57th Street in Midtown Manhattan has historically housed many prestigious art galleries and continues to do so today. Rosenberg initially mounted exhibitions focusing on French masters of the late 19th century, such as Monet and Van Gogh, which he knew would appeal to American taste. But he also continued to promote the Cubist artists, and he was a major lender to MoMA's 1940 Picasso retrospective. But Rosenberg's patronage also turned in a new direction in New York as they began promoting a select group of American artists. These included Max Weber, Marston Hartley, and Abraham Ratner, all of whom had solo shows at the Rosenberg Gallery between 1942 and 1950. Drawing upon Cubism and German Expressionism, their visual language became particularly prominent in American art of the 1940s, kind of pre-abstract expressionism. Sometimes dubbed figurative expressionists, these artists tended to explore social, political, and psychological issues in their work, sometimes indirectly or through metaphor. Critics and curators in the early 1940s considered them to be in the vanguard of American art. But today, with a few exceptions, such as Hartley, their work is hardly known. In light of Rosenberg's attachment to the best-known figures of modern French painting, it is interesting that the American artists he supported ultimately did not generally make it into the canon of American modernism. And let's take a look at one of these marginalized artists. The Eskenazi has in its collection a major Abraham Ratner painting, Place of Darkness, which was featured in the artist's solo exhibition at the Rosenberg Gallery in May of 1943. It's possible that Ratner and Rosenberg actually got to know each other before the war and before Rosenberg's immigration. Ratner, who was born in Poughkeepsie, New York, to Russian Jewish immigrant parents, lived in Paris in the 1920s and 30s, and may well have visited exhibitions at Paul Rosenberg's gallery there. Certainly, he was familiar with one of Rosenberg's most prominent artists, Pablo Picasso. Place of Darkness contains clear echoes of Guernica, which Picasso painted in the aftermath of the 1937 bombing of a Basque village by the Germans. Ratner's painting addresses the Holocaust, reports of which were beginning to filter into the US in 1942. But rather than literally portray the German atrocities, which Ratner would have had difficulty visualizing at such an early date due to a lack of photography, he instead sought to convey a general sense of human depravity in this composition. Henry Hope acquired the piece from Rosenberg around 1947 and donated it to IU in 1958. By that time, in the late 1950s, Ratner's emotionally charged work was becoming unfashionable as abstract expressionism was entering the canon and as pop art and minimalism were beginning to emerge. So after spending many years languishing in storage, the Ratner painting has only been put back on view in recent years. And in that time, many visitors have expressed that it's one of their favorite works in our collection. So perhaps Paul Rosenberg's instincts about which artist to patronize were correct after all, for taste and fashion, as we know, can be cyclical. Let's return now to Kurt Valentine, who I introduced last week in the session on German modernism and so-called degenerate art. In the post-war years, Henry Hope developed a strong relationship with Valentine, who helped him build up his personal collection, much of which is now at the Eskenazi Museum. Valentine worked closely with all the major American art museums and collectors of his day, and his influence as a tastemaker in certain realms of modern art was immense. As a reminder, Valentine established himself as one of the most prominent dealers of German Expressionism in the US, beginning in 1937, when he established a branch of the Berlin-based Buchholz Gallery in New York. Through his connection with the German dealer Karl Buchholz, who was authorized by the Third Reich to sell degenerate art from the German museums, Valentine had ready access to some of the best examples of Expressionism. And as discussed last week, Valentine's strategy for creating an American market for German modernism included mounting exhibitions, which utilized Expressionism to draw attention to Nazi anti-modern art propaganda. Many of the Expressionist works Valentine handled were by artists who were no longer living. One exception was Max Beckmann, whose paintings you can see in this slide. Beginning in 1938, Valentine mounted 10 exhibitions devoted to Beckmann's work, and he played a major role in facilitating opportunities and commissions for the artist in the United States. Yet although the Eskenazi Museum has a fairly large collection of German Expressionism, few of these works were acquired directly through Kurt Valentine. Our Expressionist holdings mostly entered the museum in the 1970s and were acquired from other dealers of German art, such as Sergei Sabarsky. Valentine died in 1954, before the Eskenazi Museum was truly operational. His connection to us then is through the works he sold Henry Hope privately. And Hope had a strong preference for French and American art over German Expressionism, but Max Beckmann was an exception. In 1950, with Valentine's assistance, Hope commissioned this family portrait from Max Beckmann, who has an interesting connection to Bloomington. In the talk 2 weeks ago, we looked at Bernard and Kola Haydn, the musician couple who immigrated to the US in 1935. As you might recall, the Haydns were close friends of Max Beckmann. Upon their arrival in Bloomington just after World War II, the Haydns quickly became friends with Henry Hope and other members of the art department. It was at Kola Haydn's urging that Hope reached out to Max Beckmann in 1947, offering him a faculty position in the art department. Beckmann had fled Germany 10 years earlier, immediately following the opening of the Degenerate Art exhibition, and he had settled in Amsterdam. He had long wanted to come to the US, but had been denied a visa. That situation changed after the war, when he found himself considering offers from several American universities. The Haydn papers at IU's Lilly Library preserve correspondence with Beckmann in which he asks about Bloomington's cultural life and its proximity to Indianapolis, the nearest large city. Finding the answers unsatisfactory, he instead accepted a teaching offer from Washington University in St. Louis. Nevertheless, Beckmann traveled twice to Bloomington. The first trip was in 1948 to judge an art exhibition, which his diary tells us he found deadly boring. And he came again in 1950 to make preliminary sketches, such as this, for the Hope's family portrait. Hope's recollections reveal Kurt Valentine's role in facilitating the commission. The choice of Beckmann was made for two reasons. One, I admired the several portraits he did in St. Louis and the group portraits done in Amsterdam. The other reason was that we were close friends of Kurt Valentine and he offered to make the arrangements for us. The Hope family portrait was Beckmann's largest group portrait. In his diary, he expressed some consternation about the endeavor, writing at the beginning of April 1950, "I'm going briefly to Bloomington, Indiana, in order to paint a couple with 6 children. Oh my God, but I'm sure things will work out." Despite later diary entries, which described his work on the Hope portrait as hopeless, Beckmann was finally satisfied with the composition at the end of May 1950. And Valentine arranged for it to be displayed at the Whitney Museum's biennial before sending it on to Bloomington. Despite their interest in Beckmann, Henry and his wife Sally preferred French and American modern art, as I've already mentioned, and they had a particular affinity for sculpture. In this too, they were aided by Kurt Valentine, who developed a secondary specialty in New York as an expert in modernist sculpture. Among the sculptures the Hopes acquired from Valentine, and which are now in the Eskenazi's collection, are these works by Marino Marini, Henry Moore, and Jacques Lipchitz. We'll focus in some depth now on Lipchitz, who, like Kurt Valentine, was a wartime exile. Henry Hope was a keen supporter of Lipchitz, an artist who formed a bridge between the French and American art worlds. Hope read an article on Lipchitz's sculpture in conjunction with the Venice Biennale of 1952 and authored the catalog for Lipchitz's retrospective at MoMA in 1954. And he owned 2 sculptures, representing very different periods of the artist's career. Born to an Orthodox Jewish family in Lithuania, Lipchitz moved to Paris in 1909 to study art, arriving just as Picasso and Braque were painting their first Cubist canvases. In his writings, Henry Hope expressed his belief that Lipchitz was among the most successful sculptors to translate the Cubist aesthetic into 3 dimensions. I'm sorry, here's a photo I meant to show you of Lipchitz. Now we'll look at one of his Cubist sculptures, the 1919 Draped Woman. And this is a post-war cast, which is now in the Eskenazi's collection, and it did not come from Henry Hope. So Lipchitz continued to thrive as a sculptor in interwar Paris, becoming ever more innovative, as in his group of sculptures known as the Transparents. One of the Lipchitz sculptures the Hopes acquired from Valentine is the 1926 transparent Harlequin with Guitar. In the Transparents, Lipchitz experimented with new formal and technical innovations that surpassed those of the Cubist idiom he had previously mastered. The Transparents incorporate an unprecedented amount of negative or open space into their compositions. We see this clearly in Harlequin with Guitar, whose intertwining positive and negative spaces results in a very intricate and dynamic composition, almost like a collage constructed of disparate elements. When Valentine put this work on the market in 1953, Hope purchased it immediately, and it ranks as one of the most important works from the Hope collection overall. Indeed, Lipschitz had kept the sculpture in his possession, even managing to bring it with him to America. So after the Nazi occupation of Paris in 1940, Lipschitz and his wife fled to Toulouse, and with the assistance of the Emergency Rescue Committee, which worked to obtain American visas for artists, they were able to settle in New York in 1941. The following year, Lipschitz began regularly exhibiting at Kurt Valentine's gallery, and along with many other prominent refugee artists from Europe, he changed the character of the American art world in the 1940s. Many believe that the energy and aesthetic ideas that exiled artists such as Lipschitz brought with them to the US paved the way for the development of abstract expressionism and for the emergence of New York as the center of the Western art world in the post-war period. In 1946, the art critic Clement Greenberg compared the scale, energy, and ambition of Lipschitz's current sculptures to the paintings of Jackson Pollock. So maybe we should look at one of his post-war sculptures. Following the war, Lipschitz chose to remain in the United States, becoming a citizen in 1956. In the US, the character of his sculpture changed dramatically, as I've already suggested. He no longer adhered even remotely to a Cubist aesthetic, but now blended aspects of expressionism and surrealism, styles associated with human emotions and psychology. The rise of fascism in Europe, which forced him into exile and culminated in the Holocaust, led him to begin engaging with mythic and biblical themes during the 1930s, and these subjects continued to occupy him for the rest of his life. The bronze sculpture Song of Songs from 1945 refers to the biblical book of the same title and is representative of this later phase in his career. This piece was acquired by Henry Hope in 1946 and was the first of his Lipschitz acquisitions. Given his special interest in Lipschitz, Hope had informed Kurt Valentine that we want to get one of the artist's most outstanding works. In his reply, Valentine offered the opinion that Song of Songs, which he had recently featured in the artist's solo exhibition at his gallery, is one of the best and most important things which Lipschitz has done in the last few years. The final dealer we'll look at tonight is Leo Castelli, who dedicated himself to the advancement of post-war American art. The Eskenazi Museum has several works in its collection that went through Castelli's gallery. Our Jackson Pollock painting is believed to be one of them. More research is needed, but it may have been included in exhibitions in 1957 or 58 at the Castelli Gallery. Other works in our collection that were handled by Castelli include these works by Andy Warhol, Robert Rauschenberg, and Donald Judd. They were acquired by the museum in the 1960s and 70s under the leadership both of Henry Hope and of Thomas T. Solly, the museum's second director. Let's take a look at Leo Castelli's biography. He was born Leo Kraus in 1907 to a Jewish family in the northeast Italian city of Trieste. At the time, the city was part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Castelli's father, Ernst Kraus, a banker, was from Hungary. His mother, Bianca Castelli, came from a wealthy family of coffee importers in Trieste. At some point, the family changed its surname from Kraus to Castelli, possibly after World War I, when Trieste, no longer under Austrian rule, underwent a period of intense Italianization. Leo Castelli initially worked for an insurance company in Bucharest, where he met and married his first wife, Ilyana Shapira. In 1934, they moved to Paris, where he worked at the Banca d'Italia. It was in Paris that he opened his first gallery, which was named for its co-director, René Drouin. The Drouin Gallery specialized in surrealism, and it would become a very influential gallery during the 1940s. Leo Castelli, however, would not play a great role in its evolution. The gallery opened in July 1939, and less than 2 months later, World War II began. Castelli and his wife, who was also Jewish, fled Paris for the south of France, and in March 1941, they were able to immigrate to the United States. Castelli's parents died in Budapest, where they were subjected to persecution by Hungarian fascists. In New York, Castelli was not able to take up art dealing right away. Instead, he worked for several years for his father-in-law's garment business. He also served in the US Army during World War II, working with the OSS, the intelligence service, thanks to his facility with languages. He spoke 5. Nevertheless, he started to make inroads into New York's avant-garde artistic circles, and by the late 40s had gotten to know many of the major figures of the abstract expressionist movement. In 1951, he organized a major abstract expressionist show in New York's East Village. In 1957, he finally opened his own gallery on the Upper East Side. His opening exhibition was devoted again to abstract expressionism, and as I suggested, may have included our Pollock. But already in 1958, Castelli started to shift his focus to a new generation of American artists, those who would become the pioneers of pop art, minimalism, and conceptual art. He was particularly attracted to artists who had absorbed the legacy of Marcel Duchamp, who had pioneered proto-conceptual ideas with his famous ready-mades between 1913 and 1921. A limited edition of authorized replicas of Duchamp's ready-mades was issued in 1964 by the Italian art dealer Arturo Schwartz. And the Eskenazi Museum, by the way, is the only American museum with a complete set of the 1964 ready-mades edition. And I'm showing you 2 of the most famous pieces right here. Castelli saw Duchamp as one of the most critical figures of 20th century art, and he especially promoted artists like Robert Rauschenberg, who similarly incorporated assemblage, found objects, and references to popular culture in their work. The minimalist artists he promoted, like Donald Judd, also followed in Duchamp's footsteps in emphasizing the conceptual basis of a work of art over its craftsmanship. Castelli once said, "The key figure in my gallery is somebody that I never showed, and that was Marcel Duchamp. Painters who are not influenced by Duchamp just don't belong here." It's important to note that while the artists Castelli promoted, figures such as Robert Rauschenberg, Jasper Johns, and Andy Warhol, are seminal figures in the history of post-war American art, they were practically unknown when Castelli took notice of them. In fact, he preferred working with emerging artists whose careers he could shape and nurture over the long term. He even paid his artists stipends whether or not their work sold, and this gave them the freedom to continue experimenting and developing their ideas. Castelli also helped advance the reputation of American art in Europe, which was no small feat. American art had never enjoyed much prestige in Europe, and European art likewise enjoyed a higher status in the US, especially prior to World War II. It wasn't until the late 1950s that even abstract expressionism gained widespread recognition in Europe, thanks to a touring show circulated by the Museum of Modern Art. Another watershed moment was when Robert Rauschenberg, one of Castelli's artists, won the grand prize at the Venice Biennale in 1964. And he was just the second American artist to win this prestigious award. As these examples from the Eskenazi Museum's collection reveal, Castelli played a key role in promoting 3 of the most significant American art movements of the mid-20th century: abstract expressionism, pop art, and minimalism. And this constitutes a major difference between Castelli and the other 2 dealers we looked at tonight. Both Paul Rosenberg and Kurt Valentine promoted selected American artists, but they remained largely devoted to European modernism, and in particular to styles that emerged before World War II. Castelli, by contrast, devoted himself completely to American artists, especially those who were the most experimental and conceptually forward-thinking. But although all 3 dealers had different approaches and interests, all immeasurably enriched and expanded the American art world. So thank you for joining me tonight. I hope you've gained some insight into the workings of the art world in general and into the Eskenazi Museum's collection in particular. I also hope you've enjoyed this series, and if you missed any of the talks, as Erin mentioned, we will have recordings available, we hope around the end of the month, and you will receive an email with those links when they're ready. So at this time, I'd be happy to take some questions, and Erin will help to facilitate that. And again, if you do have questions, please do write them in the chat box.
Thank you, Jenny. We also want to thank the Terra Foundation for American Art for their support for this event. And I believe that's all we have for you all today. I see lots of thank yous in the chat box. So we're very grateful to Jenny, all the work that you've put in the past several weeks to put these on for us.
Well, I'm thrilled that so many of you have joined us, and thank you again for your questions and for your interest in this, I think, very important topic.
Absolutely. Hope you all have a wonderful night. Thank you for joining us.
Good night.